Governance by partnership has to do with what I think is the primary role of a board in a congregation, especially a congregation with a clergy leader. And that is to maintain a positive and constructive relationship between the board and that clergy leader. I don't mean that they necessarily are friends or that they necessarily agree about things all the time, although some easy social time is a very important part of keeping good communication. What I mean is that the board is clear with that leader of the ministry activity, the head of staff, if you will, about what authority the board has given, what expectations the board has, what goals the church has that it needs to achieve through that ministry activity, and how that person is going to be held accountable for the use of the authority he or she has been given. And that clarity is the basis in the long run for the friendship, the easiness, the creativity, the good conversation that's really the basis of good partnership. There's a mistake that a lot of liberal congregations make, which is to assume that the best partnership is created by having really fuzzy boundaries of authority. So we talk about shared ministry sometimes in a way that suggests that the last thing we would ever want to do is to be clear about what buck stops where, or who gets to make a final decision about particular things that can't be appealed to the other. Well, what I find is that in almost any area of human life, when people have unclear authority boundaries, they approach partnership with caution. They are very careful about how they enter into conversation because they're afraid that they'll lose some of the independence or authority that they thought they had. Whereas if decision-making boundaries are really clear, then people can be much more transparent and flexible about how they interact, how they help each other, what they talk about. They don't need to keep secrets as much because they know that in the end it'll be clear where the decision will be made. If I'm clear about decisions I can make, I can receive all kinds of input in a much more open way, and then I decide based on all that input. Another way of getting at this is to talk about effective delegation, which is for the board a really critical part of partnership. For staff members, it's a critical part in dealing with each other. But think about the board. There are really three things that need to be kept in balance. One is the authority itself. The second is the guidance that's given. And the third is the accountability for the use of the authority. In churches, I find in general that we're very, very good at giving authority without holding people accountable. We particularly do that with volunteers. We say things like, you can't fire a volunteer. Well, if you give somebody, if they do it for free, you can't criticize how they do it. This is just a mistake, even with volunteers. The other mistake we often make is that we hold people accountable for things that they never had authority to control. And the place where we often do that is with paid staff members, that we say at the end of the year, oh, sorry, the attendance is down. It must be the minister or the rabbi must be doing something wrong. And that's fine, except if the clergy leader has never been given appropriate authority to make it reasonable to hold them accountable for results, then that's just not fair. The question for a board is, do they really mean to create conditions where the congregation is most likely to succeed at what it sets out to do, and putting people in a position where they have maximum scope to try ways to fail without losing the authority to try again, and to evaluate and learn from experience. That's the most fertile atmosphere for success, not just for the head of staff, but for everybody working in ministry. And in order to achieve that, the board has to be very careful about what it takes appeals from. One of the ways that boards engage in poor partnership practices is to set themselves up as a kind of appellate court, where anybody at any part of the organization who's unhappy with a decision ends up coming to the board, because that's where the ultimate power is to decide things. Healthy boards, once they delegate authority and responsibility and give guidance in an area, refuse to take appeals from decisions that have been properly made in that area, except for very extreme circumstances. Every board needs a way of dealing with whistleblowers or misconduct allegations or other very hopefully unusual but certainly very serious breaches of covenant by people with authority. But that needs to be very clearly an exception rather than the rule, as it is in many congregations. The question for the board where somebody's unhappy is, do we have we a policy that's been violated? Do we need a policy we don't have? Do we need to change a policy that we do have? Or finally, is there a great injustice or a serious violation or a serious risk to someone's safety or health that's at stake here? In which case we activate those exceptional places where the board, any board, would and should step in and take practical control. But generally that's not what you're aiming for. So to exercise good partnership requires some structure. And briefly, I've suggested in the book, in Chapter 8 especially, some ways of creating annually board work products that will help to be clear about setting direction for the church at an appropriate board level. One piece is an annual vision of ministry, which you might also call a set of 3 top goals or top priorities. It has to be a short list. 3, 2, or 1 top priorities is just fine. 4, 5, or 6 is too many. Because if you get too many, first of all, it's not priorities anymore, and secondly, nobody remembers what they are. It doesn't have the kind of impact. It's important to remember that just because something's not a top priority doesn't mean it won't happen. But it is the board's responsibility to be clear about what is the top priority. Usually in a year would be a good planning length of time. I also suggest that the board define each year up to 3 open questions that it intends to work with the staff and with the whole congregation to inquire over time about some of the big questions that are longer term and are most important for the future as distinct from daily operations. Questions like, what is our purpose in having education for children? What is our ministry in this community? Are there groups in this community that we intend to reach as members or partner as partners with that we're not currently? And what do we need to learn and how do we need to change in order to be better neighbors to others in our community? Those kinds of questions, tailored and made specific to a local congregation's situation, are worthy of a longer conversation that's centered in the board, but includes the senior members of the ministry staff, and also the entire congregation is invited as they're willing. Typically there are 60 to 80 people in most congregations who are interested in being part of that conversation, and inviting them in a consistent way to be part of a connected conversation over a year is a very good thing to do. Finally, a work product for the board is to get around to that evaluation conversation. There's a lot to say about evaluation. I say some of it in the book. And I'll say here just that evaluation to be healthy needs to be mutual, needs to be designed in partnership between the parties, and it needs to be clear and frank. And you need, this is the most important thing really, you need to get around to it, which is the hardest thing I find for boards to do. So that's governance by partnership, all the ways that the board maintains a good relationship with those who are working in ministry, particularly with the person who's been put in charge in ministry. The second kind of governance is governance by conversation. And that's that year-long conversation about the open questions, or whatever way you choose to structure that. The best boards are not the ones that work in isolation or go off on a mountaintop or on retreat and come back and surprise everyone with a new sense of direction. Certainly they don't do it in isolation from their head of staff, but they shouldn't do it in isolation with anyone. One of the most important ways of getting a new idea accepted in a congregation is to give a lot of warning that you're thinking about it. The most important thing a proposal can have going for it before any group is that it's been heard of before. So you want to have the courage to tell everyone about the questions you're thinking about before you know the answers. That's something that goes against every grain of some people's instincts, that we like to be sure, we like to be fully prepared, we like to know answers before we even admit we have questions. And I'm encouraging a reversal of that, and I know it takes courage. But that's how you open up the best kind of conversation, and effective boards govern as much by conversation as in any other way. And then finally, governance by policy. There is a set of model policies in the second edition of Governance and Ministry. I hope that you will use that and benefit by it, but not just copy and adopt it, because every congregation needs to cover all the bases that are there, but it also needs to do it in a way that is consistent with its culture and its intentions. So be sure to run all of my language through your brains and in your conversation before you adopt it. Sometimes people wonder a very basic question, and I'll finish with this, about what is a policy? And how is a policy different from anything else a board does? Boards do lots of things, some of which are not policy. For example, a board might decide to elect someone to be a delegate to a denominational meeting. That's a one-time decision that is not a policy decision. Or it might decide to approve a rental of part of the building by a group outside, and that would be with dates attached and just a one-time decision. Those things are not policies. Policies are decisions that control decision-making over time. So they're lasting, they're written, they're made accessible in some way. I think the best way to make policies accessible is to include them in a policy book. Of course, they're recorded in the board minutes, but I wouldn't depend on the board minutes as the main point of reference. So you have to hunt through months and months of minutes to see what the policy is. No, collect them also in a policy book. That's also a way of disciplining the board to notice every time and to make a decision whether it means to be making policy or not. So there's no confusion about a one-off decision, which somebody might think is a policy or perhaps a precedent, that it is or isn't, because you'll know, because if it's policy, you'll put it in the policy book. If it's not, you don't.